The shouting started before sunrise. Neighbors stepped outside, confused by the sudden noise echoing through the quiet suburban street. A woman's voice cut through the morning air like a siren, angry, loud, and demanding. Everyone on Maple Ridge Drive already knew that voice. Karen. For months, she had been the neighborhood's most feared presence. She complained about parked cars, children playing too loudly, delivery trucks blocking the road, even the color of someone's mailbox. Nothing was ever good enough for Karen. But this morning felt different. A young man named Daniel stood in his driveway, holding his phone, quietly recording everything. He had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years and had endured Karen's constant harassment for just as long. "Move your car right now," Karen screamed, pointing aggressively at Daniel's pickup truck. "It's parked in my driveway," Daniel replied calmly. Karen crossed her arms, her face twisted with anger. "You're violating law regulations," she snapped. "That truck is an eyesore." Daniel shook his head. "There's no rule against it." But Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about control. Without warning, she marched toward Daniel's truck and slapped a bright orange violation sticker on the windshield. The neighbors watching from their windows gasped. This time, Karen had crossed a line. Daniel stepped forward, trying to remain calm. "You can't touch my property," he said firmly. Karen smirked. "Oh yes, I can." What Karen didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't just another neighbor she could intimidate. He was gathering evidence, and this moment, this exact confrontation, was about to become the turning point that would change everything. Because hidden behind Daniel's calm expression was weeks of preparation. Legal documents, witness statements, security footage, and a lawyer who had been waiting patiently for Karen to make one final mistake. The neighbors didn't know it yet, but the loud argument unfolding in the driveway was only the beginning. Within hours, police cars would arrive. Within days, the entire neighborhood would learn the truth about Karen's actions. And within weeks, Karen herself would be standing in a courtroom, facing consequences she never imagined. But at that moment, standing beside Daniel's truck, Karen still believed she was untouchable. She leaned closer and whispered something under her breath. A threat. Daniel's phone captured every word. And the moment that video reached the internet, everything would change. Karen thought she was enforcing the rules. Instead, she had just handed over the evidence that would bring her down. The quiet neighborhood of Maple Ridge Drive was about to witness something no one expected. Justice. And it was coming faster than Karen realized. The moment Karen walked away from Daniel's driveway, she believed she had won. She strutted down the sidewalk confidently, convinced that once again she had forced a neighbor to obey her authority. For years, this had been her routine: intimidate, threaten, complain, and watch people back down. But Daniel didn't move his truck. Instead, he slowly lowered his phone and looked at the recording he had just captured. Every word, every threat, every moment Karen touched his property without permission. It was all there. Across the street, several neighbors began walking toward him. Mrs. Alvarez, who had lived there for nearly 20 years, shook her head in disbelief. "She's gone too far this time," she said quietly. Another neighbor, Tom, crossed his arms. "That's not the first sticker she's put on someone's car," he added. "She did it to me last month." Daniel looked at them carefully. For the first time, people weren't just whispering about Karen, they were speaking openly. And that changed everything. "Would you be willing to say that officially?" Daniel asked. The neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Karen had a reputation for retaliation. People who challenged her often found themselves buried in law complaints, fines, or strange violations. But something about this morning felt different. Tom nodded slowly. "I'm tired of it," he said. "Yeah, I'll talk." Mrs. Alvarez agreed. "So will I." Within minutes, 3 more neighbors joined the conversation. Each of them had their own story. Parking violations that didn't exist. False noise complaints. Threats of law fines. Karen had built her authority on fear. But now that fear was beginning to crack. Daniel smiled slightly. "Good," he said, "because this isn't just about a sticker." He opened a folder sitting on the passenger seat of his truck. Inside were printed emails, law bylaws, and several official documents. Tom leaned closer. "What's all this?" Daniel took a deep breath. For the past 2 months, he explained, "I've been documenting everything Karen has done." Mrs. Alvarez's eyes widened. "You planned this?" "Not exactly," Daniel said. "But after the fifth fake complaint she filed against me, I realized something." "What?" Tom asked. Daniel held up a document. "Karen doesn't actually have the authority she claims." The group stared at him in confusion. "You mean, she's not allowed to do this?" Mrs. Alvarez asked. Daniel shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the orange sticker on his windshield. "That alone could be considered property damage and harassment." The neighbors exchanged stunned looks. For years they had assumed Karen had the power she claimed. But what if she didn't? At that moment, Daniel's phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. He opened it and read the words silently. Then he smiled. "What is it?" Tom asked. Daniel locked his phone and looked back at the group. "Let's just say," he said calmly, "Karen made a very big mistake today." Across the street, Karen stood on her porch, watching the group talk. She couldn't hear what they were saying. But she could feel something shifting. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't afraid of her. And she had no idea the evidence against her was already growing. Karen stood on her porch with her arms folded, watching the neighbors gathered near Daniel's driveway. Something about the scene made her uneasy. Normally, when she confronted someone, the situation ended quickly. People apologized. They moved their cars. They avoided eye contact. But today was different. No one was leaving. Instead, more neighbors were stepping outside their homes, quietly observing the growing conversation across the street. Karen could feel control slipping from her grasp, and she didn't like it. Inside his driveway, Daniel continued speaking calmly with the small group forming around him. "Look," he said, holding the folder of documents. "This situation isn't just about me." Tom nodded. "We know." Daniel flipped through several pages and handed one to Mrs. Alvarez. "This is the WA agreement," he explained. "Read section 14. She adjusted her glasses and read the paragraph slowly. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "This says only the board can issue official violations," she said. "Exactly," Daniel replied. Tom frowned. "But Karen gives them out all the time." Daniel nodded. "That's the problem." Another neighbor, Lisa, stepped closer. "She gave me 3 warnings last year about my garden decorations," she said. "I thought they were official." "They weren't," Daniel replied. The group exchanged shocked glances. For years, Karen had acted like she controlled the neighborhood rules. She spoke confidently, carried printed notices, and threatened fines. But if Daniel was right, those warnings meant nothing. Worse than nothing. They might actually be illegal. Daniel continued carefully. "I spoke to the WA management company 2 weeks ago," he said. "Karen isn't even on the board anymore." Silence fell across the driveway. Mrs. Alvarez blinked. "What? She resigned 6 months ago," Daniel explained. "But she kept pretending she still had authority." Tom shook his head slowly. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." Daniel then held up his phone. "And everything she just did today is recorded." At that moment, a car turned the corner at the end of the street. A black sedan rolled slowly down Maple Ridge Drive and parked near Daniel's house. Karen noticed immediately. Her stomach tightened. 2 people stepped out of the car. One was a woman in a dark blazer carrying a briefcase. The other held a clipboard. Daniel smiled when he saw them. "They're here," he said quietly. Tom looked confused. "Who?" Daniel closed the folder and walked toward the sidewalk. "My lawyer," he said. Across the street, Karen's confidence cracked for the first time that morning. She watched as Daniel greeted the 2 visitors and began speaking with them. The woman in the blazer nodded while reviewing the documents. Then she looked directly toward Karen's house. Karen quickly stepped back from the porch railing. Something about the woman's serious expression made Karen's pulse quicken. For the first time in a long time, Karen realized something dangerous. This wasn't a neighborhood argument anymore. This was becoming a legal situation. And she might be at the center of it. Daniel's lawyer turned another page in the folder and spoke quietly to him. Daniel nodded. Then the lawyer said 4 words that would soon change Karen's life. "Let's call the police." Across the street, Karen had no idea the plan against her was already moving forward. But within minutes, flashing lights would appear on Maple Ridge Drive. And the woman who believed she controlled the neighborhood was about to face something she could not control. The law. Karen was inside her house when the distant sound of sirens reached Maple Ridge Drive. At first, she ignored it. Police cars occasionally passed through the area, usually responding to traffic calls or minor incidents on nearby roads. There was no reason for her to worry. But the sirens didn't pass. They grew louder, closer. Karen walked toward her front window and peeked through the curtain. Her stomach dropped instantly. 2 police cars slowly turned onto the street and stopped directly in front of Daniel's house. Red and blue lights flashed across the quiet neighborhood, reflecting off parked cars and windows. Neighbors began stepping outside their homes again, whispering and pointing toward the scene. Karen felt a sudden wave of irritation. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. She grabbed her purse and stormed outside. If Daniel thought calling the police would scare her, he clearly didn't understand who he was dealing with. Karen walked across the street with confident steps, her expression already forming into the outraged look she used so often. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles. Daniel and his lawyer were waiting on the sidewalk. Karen arrived just as the conversation began. "Officers," Daniel's lawyer said calmly, shaking one officer's hand, "thank you for coming." Karen interrupted immediately. "Oh good, you're here," she said loudly. "This man has been violating law regulations for months." The officers glanced at each other briefly. One of them turned toward Karen. "Ma'am," he said politely, "we'll hear from everyone." Karen crossed her arms. "Well, it's very simple," she continued. "He refuses to follow community rules, and I've had to issue several violations." Daniel remained silent. His lawyer simply opened the folder again and handed several documents to the officer. The officer began reading. As he scanned the pages, his expression slowly changed. Karen noticed. "What exactly are you looking at?" she asked. The officer looked up. "These are statements from several residents," he said. Karen scoffed. "Oh please. They're probably exaggerating." The officer flipped to another page. "And this appears to be video footage," he added. Daniel calmly held up his phone. "I recorded our interaction this morning," he said. Karen's confidence faltered for a split second. But she quickly recovered. "Good," she snapped. "Then you'll see that I was enforcing the rules." The officer watched the video carefully. The screen showed Karen placing the violation sticker on Daniel's windshield. It also captured the threat she whispered moments later. The officer paused the video. He looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are you currently a member of the HOA board?" Karen hesitated. "Well, I used to be." "So you're not anymore?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. "No, but..." The officer raised a hand. "Then why are you issuing official violations?" Karen opened her mouth but no words came out. Across the street, several neighbors watched silently. The officer glanced back at the documents in his hand. "According to these records," he continued, "you resigned from the board 6 months ago." Karen's face turned pale. "I still help manage things," she said weakly. The officer closed the folder. "That's not how it works." Daniel's lawyer stepped forward calmly. "Officer," she said, "we'd like to file a formal complaint for harassment, property interference, and fraudulent representation of law authority." The words hung heavily in the air. Karen's eyes widened. "What? That's ridiculous." But the officer's expression remained serious. He turned toward her again. "Ma'am," he said, "we're going to need you to answer a few questions." For the first time in years, Karen wasn't the one asking questions. She was the one being investigated. And the situation was about to get much worse. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the street as the officer finished speaking. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The confident tone she normally used had vanished. "This is ridiculous," she finally snapped. "I was just doing what's best for the neighborhood." The officer kept his voice calm. "Ma'am, we're simply trying to understand the situation." Karen pointed toward Daniel. "He's the problem. His truck breaks law rules, and someone had to deal with it." Daniel's lawyer stepped forward slightly. "With respect, officer," she said, "the law bylaws clearly state that only the current board can issue formal violations. Karen is not part of that board." The officer nodded slowly. "We're aware." Karen felt the eyes of the entire neighborhood on her. Neighbors stood on sidewalks, near mailboxes, and in driveways, quietly watching the confrontation unfold. For years, Karen had been the one standing confidently while others shrank under pressure. Now the roles were reversed. The officer turned to Daniel. "Sir, could you explain what led to today's incident?" Daniel spoke calmly. "For months, Karen has been placing fake violation notices on residents' property," he explained. "She's threatened fines, made false complaints, and harassed people who questioned her authority." The officer scribbled notes. "And the sticker on your truck. She placed it there this morning without permission." The officer glanced toward the bright orange notice still stuck to the windshield. Karen quickly tried to interrupt. "It's not fake," she insisted. "I printed them exactly like the WA forms." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You printed them yourself?" Karen paused, realizing too late what she had just admitted. Daniel's lawyer gently took the opportunity. "Officer," she said, opening the folder again, "we also have copies of emails Karen sent to multiple residents demanding payment for supposed HOA fines." The officer examined the printed emails. Karen felt panic creeping into her chest. They owed those fines, she argued quickly. "According to whom?" the officer asked. Karen hesitated again. No one spoke. The silence became heavy. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward from the group of neighbors. "She tried to fine me $200 for having wind chimes," she said softly. Tom added, "She threatened to tow my car if I didn't move it from my own driveway." Another neighbor, Lisa, shook her head. "She told me she'd report me to the WA board if I didn't remove my garden lights." The officer slowly closed the folder. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "collecting or demanding money under false authority could be considered fraud." Karen's face drained of color. "That's insane," she whispered. But the officer's tone remained serious. "At the very least, we're looking at harassment and interference with private property." Karen suddenly realized something terrifying. All the neighbors she had intimidated over the years were now standing together. And they were speaking. The officer turned toward Daniel's lawyer again. "Are you formally requesting that we document these complaints?" "Yes," she replied calmly. "And we intend to pursue legal action." Karen's breathing became shallow. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had always controlled the situation. But now the evidence was stacking up, the witnesses were speaking, and the police were writing everything down. Karen looked around desperately. For the first time in years, no one looked afraid of her. Instead, they looked relieved. And Karen began to understand something she never expected. Her actions had consequences, and those consequences were just beginning. The tension on Maple Ridge Drive grew heavier with every passing minute. Karen stood silently as the officer finished writing notes on his clipboard. The flashing lights from the patrol cars painted red and blue reflections across the houses, turning the quiet street into something that felt like a crime scene. Karen hated it. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, trying to regain her confidence. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." The officer looked up. "Ma'am, multiple residents have now given statements." Karen shook her head quickly. "They're exaggerating." But the officer continued speaking. "And we have video evidence of you placing unauthorized violation notices on private property." Karen's jaw tightened. "That's not illegal," she argued. Daniel's lawyer calmly stepped forward again. "Actually, it can be," she said. Karen glared at her. The lawyer continued in a steady voice. "Representing yourself as an authority you no longer hold, issuing fake enforcement notices, and demanding fines could fall under fraudulent misrepresentation." Karen scoffed loudly. "That's ridiculous." But the officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, did you collect any money from residents for these supposed fines?" Karen hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a second. But it was enough. The officer noticed immediately. "How much?" he asked. Karen crossed her arms defensively. "It wasn't much." A murmur spread through the watching neighbors. Daniel's lawyer spoke again. "Officer, we have records of at least 3 payments made to Karen through digital transfers." Karen's eyes widened. "How did you?" She stopped herself. Too late. The officer wrote something else down. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "those payments may qualify as fraud if they were collected under false authority." Karen suddenly felt the situation slipping completely out of control. "This is insane," she insisted. "I was just maintaining order in the neighborhood." But one of the officers had already started walking toward his patrol car. He opened the door and spoke briefly into the radio. Karen's heart began to race. "What are you doing?" she demanded. The officer returned calmly. "We're documenting the situation and verifying information with the wale management company." Daniel remained quiet, standing beside his lawyer. Karen pointed at him angrily. "You set this up." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "You did." The neighbors watching nearby couldn't help whispering to each other. For years they had watched Karen intimidate people with threats and complaints. Now they were witnessing something none of them ever expected. Karen being held accountable. The officer returned his attention to Karen. "Ma'am, depending on what the wale confirms, you could be facing several potential charges." Karen felt her stomach twist. "What charges?" The officer spoke clearly. "Harassment, fraudulent representation, and potentially theft by deception." The words felt like a punch to Karen's chest. "That's impossible," she shouted. But the officer remained calm. "At this point, we're gathering statements and evidence. What happens next will depend on the investigation." Karen looked around the street again. The neighbors were no longer whispering quietly. They were watching her closely. And for the first time in a very long time, Karen realized something terrifying. She wasn't the one in control anymore. The law was. And the investigation had only just begun. The flashing lights eventually faded from Maple Ridge Drive, but the tension in the neighborhood did not disappear. After nearly an hour of questioning and statements, the police officers finally finished documenting the incident. Before leaving, they reminded everyone that the situation was now part of an official investigation. Karen stood near her porch, watching the patrol cars slowly drive away. Her mind raced. She had faced angry neighbors before. She had argued with wale members. But this felt different. Police reports meant records. Records meant consequences. Across the street, Daniel and several neighbors were still talking quietly with his lawyer. Karen could see them pointing occasionally toward documents in the folder. Every time they did, Karen felt another wave of uneasiness. Inside her house, Karen paced back and forth across the living room. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. She picked up her phone and began scrolling through emails. Messages from neighbors, complaint letters, copies of violation notices she had printed. At the time, she had felt powerful sending them. Now they felt dangerous. Karen suddenly realized something that made her stomach tighten. There were a lot of emails. Dozens, maybe more. Across the street, Daniel's lawyer was finishing her conversation with the group. "We'll begin organizing everything tonight," she explained. "Statements, videos, emails, and payment records." Tom looked surprised. "Payment records?" Daniel nodded. "We've already identified 3 people who paid Karen fines," he said. Mrs. Alvarez shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe this went on for so long." The lawyer closed the folder carefully. "Situations like this often build slowly," she explained. "People assume authority where there isn't any, and others hesitate to challenge them." Lisa sighed. "Well, that's over now." Daniel glanced toward Karen's house. The curtains quickly closed when she noticed him looking. He turned back to the group. "The wale management company confirmed something else today," he said. "What?" Tom asked. Daniel spoke calmly. Karen had already received a warning from them last year for pretending to enforce rules. The neighbors looked stunned. "So she knew?" Mrs. Alvarez asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes. That detail made the situation far more serious." Daniel's lawyer added quietly, "If she continued after being warned, that could strengthen the legal case." As the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, the street became quiet again. But it was not the same quiet Maple Ridge Drive had known before. This quiet felt like anticipation. Inside her living room, Karen sat on the couch staring at her phone. She opened her banking app. Several small transfers appeared in the transaction list. $150, $200, $75, each labeled with vague descriptions like, "wale fine," or, "community violation." Karen's breathing grew shallow. She suddenly realized those payments might become evidence. Outside, Daniel received a new message from his lawyer. He read it and nodded slowly. Tom noticed. "What is it?" Daniel looked up. "The wale board wants to hold an emergency meeting tomorrow night," he said. "About Karen?" Daniel nodded again. "Yes." Across the street, Karen had no idea that the next stage of the investigation was already beginning. And by the time the WA meeting ended, her situation might become much worse. Because the truth about her actions was only starting to surface. And once it did, there would be no stopping what came next. Justice. The following evening, the Maple Ridge Community Center was more crowded than it had been in years. Residents filled nearly every chair in the meeting room. Some stood along the walls, whispering quietly while waiting for the meeting to begin. Word about Karen's confrontation with the police had spread quickly through the neighborhood. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. At the front of the room, the official WA board members sat behind a long table covered with documents, laptops, and folders. Their expressions were serious. Daniel sat near the front row beside his lawyer. Several neighbors who had spoken to the police the previous day were also present. But the seat everyone kept glancing at was in the back corner of the room. Karen had arrived late. She walked in stiffly, her face tense as she noticed the number of people attending. Conversation suddenly quieted as she took a seat. The WA board president, Mr. Halvorsen, tapped a small microphone. "Let's begin," he said. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for attending this emergency meeting," he continued. "We're here to address serious concerns regarding unauthorized enforcement of WA rules within the community." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mr. Halvorsen opened a folder. "First, we want to clarify something very important," he said. Karen Thompson resigned from the WA board 6 months ago. Several residents nodded, but hearing it confirmed publicly made the room feel heavier. The president continued, "Since that resignation, Karen has not had authority to issue violations, enforce rules, or collect fines on behalf of this association." Karen raised her hand suddenly. "That's not entirely accurate," she said quickly. "I've been helping maintain order." Mr. Halvorsen looked directly at her. "Karen, you were formally warned last year to stop presenting yourself as a board authority." The room filled with murmurs. Karen's face tightened. "I was only trying to keep standards high," she insisted. Daniel's lawyer quietly stood. "May I present something to the board?" she asked. Mr. Halvorsen nodded. She walked forward and placed several documents on the table. "These are emails sent by Karen to residents demanding payment for supposed HOA violations," she explained. The board members reviewed the pages carefully. Another folder followed. "Here are copies of the violation notices she placed on vehicles and property." One of the board members frowned. "These are not official forms," she said. Daniel's lawyer then handed over printed transaction records. "And these are payments collected from residents." Karen's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. "This is a setup," she shouted. But the board president raised his hand. "Karen, please sit down." She hesitated, then slowly sat again. Mr. Halvorsen looked around the room. "Several residents have already submitted statements," he continued. "And the WA management company has confirmed Karen had no authority to issue fines." He paused, then spoke clearly. "Based on the evidence presented tonight, the WA board will fully cooperate with the police investigation." Karen's eyes widened. "This is absurd," she whispered. But the board president continued speaking. "In addition, the association will be issuing formal notices to all residents clarifying that any fines collected by Karen were unauthorized." The room erupted into quiet conversation. Some neighbors looked relieved, others looked shocked. Karen sat frozen in her chair. Because in that moment, something became painfully clear. The entire community now knew the truth. And the legal consequences she once believed she could avoid were now moving closer than ever. The courtroom was silent. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long beams across the polished wooden floor. Rows of seats behind the courtroom railing were filled with residents from Maple Ridge Drive. They had come to witness the final chapter of a story that had shaken their neighborhood. At the front of the room sat Karen. Gone was the confident woman who once marched through the neighborhood issuing threats and violations. Today she sat quietly beside her attorney, her hands folded tightly together. Across the aisle sat Daniel and several neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez, Tom, Lisa. People who had once avoided Karen's confrontations were now present to see the legal outcome. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. "Please be seated," the judge said. The hearing began. The prosecutor carefully outlined the case. Over several weeks, Investigators had gathered evidence showing that Karen had falsely represented herself as an HOA authority after resigning from the board. Emails, fake violation notices, recorded threats, financial records, all of it painted the same picture. Karen had continued acting as an enforcer even after being warned to stop. And she had demanded money from residents who believed her authority was real. The prosecutor spoke clearly. Your Honor, the defendant knowingly misrepresented her position and collected payments under false claims of law enforcement. Karen stared down at the table. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. Then Daniel's video recording was played. The same confrontation from Maple Ridge Drive appeared on the courtroom screen. Karen placing the orange violation sticker on the truck. Karen threatening Daniel. Karen whispering the words that had been captured on camera. The room was quiet except for the video. When it ended, the judge folded his hands. Ms. Thompson, he said calmly, you were explicitly warned by the WA board to stop presenting yourself as an authority. Karen's lawyer spoke briefly in her defense, arguing that Karen believed she was acting in the community's best interest. But the evidence told a different story. The judge spoke again. The court finds that the defendant knowingly continued these actions after being warned, and accepted payments from residents without legal authority. Karen closed her eyes. Then the judge delivered the decision. Karen was ordered to repay every resident who had paid unauthorized fines. She would also face financial penalties for fraudulent misrepresentation and harassment. Additionally, she was prohibited from participating in any law enforcement or leadership role in the future. The gavel struck the bench. Court is adjourned. Karen remained seated as people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Across the aisle, Daniel stood and shook hands with several neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez smiled with relief. It's finally over, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes. Outside the courthouse, the residents of Maple Ridge Drive walked into the sunlight together. For the first time in years, the neighborhood
Felt peaceful, no threats, no fake violation, no fear. Justice and family arrived, and Maple Ridge Drive would never be controlled by intimidation again. If you enjoyed don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.